Okay, to start with on our discussion, may I take the honor of asking Professor Hedman the first question? Actually, it's a question being asked by one of our very senior pediatricians working in the primary healthcare service. She would like to know, is it clear? Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay, yes. The question is, Professor Hedman, you mentioned about the importance of early childhood interventions, okay? But do you mean the interventions would be equally effective as a universal program for all young children? Or should we be focused and targeted at a particular group?
Okay, this works?
Yes.
I'll try.
Universal versus targeted.
I think it's really important to separate out look, the intervention is part of a continuum. The intervention is basically doing what families do. It's supplementing families, it's working with families. And very advantaged families, children from very advantaged families are getting a great deal of stimulation already. They really are getting, and that's good. That's really part of what a healthy, functioning family does. I would argue, based on what I've seen, that the greatest returns will come for the disadvantaged families, where there really is not that kind of environment and kind of support. But in terms of the economic case that I was making, in terms of where you get maximum return, all the evidence that's showing very high returns has typically been in very disadvantaged families. Advantaged families are actually doing, and maybe doing even better than any kind of standard program is doing. So I argue on the basis of the biology and the economics that targeting is probably the most effective strategy. Oops. I see, you're getting these written.
Yes. So you know, Professor Hedman, we have actually got a quite positive message in our community that many Chinese parents actually are very enthusiastic in order to promote the development and well-being of their young kids. Right. We believe Chinese parents love their children. And then it is particular in Hong Kong, our middle-class parents who spend a lot of resources and then putting all their children to learn maybe thousands of things within a week. So do you think this kind of intervention could help in terms of their long-term development?
You mean interventions in?
In terms of those resources being spent from those middle-class parents and families in compared to the government policy in the investment into the different population.
Well, no, but I think the middle-class families will supplement expenditure. I mean, all the findings that I've had, there's some debate in the economics literature anyway, that if you offer a program to middle-class families, they only build on it. So in some sense, there's even a name for it, as a so-called Matthew effect. So you really get this kind of interaction where the child is getting more advanced. That's not saying necessarily a bad thing. But in some sense, if you think there's some kind of diminishing returns, the effects tend to be weaker than you might have otherwise experienced. So that's part of the answer to your question. But there's certainly some advantage. I mean, so yes, you can supplement the lives of middle-class children, and there will be benefit. But some of the highest benefit, if resources are scarce, are among the most disadvantaged. That's all I meant to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can everybody quiet down a bit? Yes, I have a question. I have a question from one Dr. Ip.
Not me. Yeah, another Dr. Ip, not me.
Another Dr. Ip. Simon Ip. Professor Hedman, in your opinion, would after-school stay-behind programs, say 3 hours long per day, 5 days per week, for 6 to 12-year-olds be effective in reducing inequality? It happens that this Dr. Ip is chairing the funding of such programs for 100 schools in Hong Kong.
Okay, would you mind let me to remind the audience to keep your voice a little bit softer?
Yeah,
I know
please.
It's a very exceptional opportunity for communication, but try to keep softer so that you could hear Professor Hedman's comments.
Well, but I need to hear the question. I didn't quite hear it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Now, the question is this. This is from a Dr. Ip, who chairs a charitable program that funds a program to finance stay-behind programs for school kids aged 6 to 12. And the question is, in your opinion, would such programs, which is after-school, stay-behind programs, help reduce inequality?
Oh, yes. I mean, there's no question. Well, I shouldn't say there's no question, because I don't know the specifics of this particular program. But programs that engage children, that stimulate them, and some of these after-school programs could be of the sort of music or games or sports even, can actually have substantial effects in teaching social skills and promoting a lot of engagement and exploration, which are still very important at ages 6 to 12. I'm not suggesting that somehow 6 to 12 should be shut down. All I'm suggesting is that if you were to ask the question slightly differently of comparing an investment in 6 to 12 versus like 0 to 6 months, you might find higher returns at 0 to 6 months than at 6 to 12. But there certainly are some very substantial benefits. In fact, I think it might be a lot nicer if the programs maybe diverted attention away from preparing for an exam and maybe spending more time on broadening students, musical appreciation, finding out different things, even chess. So engagement in a lot of what are typically non-academic, thought of as non-academic skills can have huge effect in kind of supplementing the life of the child. So I think there is evidence in terms of that question. But I have to know the specifics of the program.
Can I have a personal question about kids? You know, because in Hong Kong, many kids, when they go to preschool, at a very young age, they are already asked to start writing, you know. And personally, I think that is not good for kids at all. Yeah, I'd like to hear your...
Right. We had a discussion on this a few days ago when the University of Chicago opened its center. And I think it gets to the essence of what you think of as learning and how learning occurs. And I think what I have seen, especially in the earlier years, is that didactic instruction. So there's something like Baby Einstein, or you try to think about a curriculum where you want the kid to read and write. But that's just taking the school and kind of bringing it in earlier. So accelerating children in terms of how they succeed on a particular test. I think that's not really appropriate. I think what you want to do is recognize that the learning that's going on, especially at the younger years, is not all of a sort that's academic and the usual sort. And so the kind of pedagogy, that kind of typical kind of lecture notion of a schoolroom forum is not a good model for what I think early learning would be. Early learning, successful early learning, I think would engage the child, curiosity, get the child to explore, to try different things out, to interact with each other, and of course the child's parents and caregivers, but would involve a much broader notion of what learning would be about. So I think the idea of teaching the kid to learn how to read and write slightly earlier isn't as productive as getting the child to explore, to engage, and to experiment. I think that's something that has to be broadened, especially when you think of these other social and emotional skills. Even the act of getting along with others, collaborating, supporting each other, that's something that's not strictly an academic instruction, but it is powerful in terms of its implications for learning throughout life and achievement.
Thank you.
There are some questions which I think some of our panel discussion will be eager to answer. Now, the first question is talking about childhood happiness. We've got a guest from pediatrics asking about what would be the reasons to explain the difference of childhood happiness score between the 2013 and 2014 findings. And then would there be anything related to the political situation in Hong Kong, which happened recently, that could account for that?
Yes, it's very difficult to tell the reason behind this drop. Mind you, the happiness index for kids actually rose quite significantly from 12 to 13. So there was an increase. But at the same time, after we've done this 2014 survey, we found that happiness declined across the board. And this is actually in agreement with a general survey, because we also do a survey for all Hong Kong population, right? And for that survey, we also noticed that among the young people aged below 30, the happiness index has been declining in the past few years. So I think it has to do definitely with what I call mental good deprivation or something like that, because happiness is related not only to material things but also to emotional and mental satisfaction. And the fact that we have this political movement actually suggests that there's a strong sense of inadequacy, okay, in terms of satisfying some of those mental good needs. So I would say that it has to do with this mental good deprivation, so to speak. But whether this mental good deprivation has to do with a political event, that is difficult to tell. But as far as material goods is concerned, you don't really expect any difference, right? So I can only say for certain that it has to do with mental goods. And whether that mental good deprivation arises from the pressure from schoolwork, that's something yet to be determined. But we do have data showing that schoolwork pressure has gone up last year versus the previous year. Thank you.
So this one for Steve.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Professor Ho. Now, as all of our audience knows, in this evening we have a luxury of having the participation of guests from all different disciplines. So we have the opportunity of having a question from our social work colleagues. So the question is, could you enlighten us on some of the effective early childhood education investment in Hong Kong or China? And how consistent is your experience from what Professor Hedman's ideas on effective investment? May Mr. Choi, our Chief Executive of Hong Kong Council of Social Service, address this question?
Well, actually, I was thinking about something similar. I hope that I can ask Professor Hedman.
Yeah. Sure.
Because I hope that you can shed light on this area, and especially because we have some very important government officials downstairs, and maybe your advice could really help them to rethink about the strategies. For one thing, you mentioned about a lot about the importance of early childhood intervention, especially for those between 0 and 3. But actually in Hong Kong, the situation is that we do not have a lot of services for this age group of children. We have about 150,000 children at this age group. But actually, say for example, for age group between 0 and 2, not 0 to 3, 0 and 2. But actually, the provision of public day crèche service for this age group, the total number is only about 700. So 700 places for 150,000 children. So a very small proportion. It's about one place for every 2,000. Well, of course, for those more well-off families, they can pay to very, expensive playgroups or other childcare services. But for most, relatively deprived and low-income families, that's really luxurious. So we are thinking about whether we should advocate for, say, more this kind of childcare service for very young 0 to 2 or 0 to 3 children. I'm not sure if you will have the same, or you will have some suggestions for us in Hong Kong. That's something we face now in Hong Kong. And another question is about the hours of education every day. For kindergarten education, between 3 to 6, the general impression or the experts' advice would be that 3 hours every day is adequate. But actually, when I read your earlier presentation, it seems to suggest that, well, maybe longer hours may be better. But this is something very crucial in Hong Kong because the government is about to release their report on 15-year free education. That means whether the preschool, kindergarten education will be free for all children. And that's something which being debated in the welfare sector or between the welfare sector and the education sector about the number of hours. Would we consider, or should we consider longer hours rather than 3 hours, especially for those, say, for children of dual working families, where both parents have to work, and they may not have many other choices. And some of them would rely very much on foreign domestic helpers, and some may be able to rely on grandmothers and so. But we are thinking whether we should advocate for a longer hours of education for this group of children. I hope that maybe Professor Hammond can also give us some advice.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the discussion here, but on the issue of 3 hours versus longer hours, we've had some number of studies where we tried to look at the successful ingredients of the early programs. Some have been 8 hours a day, some have been 2.5 hours. What we found, though, was consistently in the successful programs, even when they've gone for 5 or 8 hours, there's usually been a core of 2 or 3 hours that has been this interaction, this process that kind of leads to success. And I think that is probably one of the constant ingredients, at least a number of programs that I've seen. A lot of the other time is spent in play, sometimes unstructured play, which could be conducted at a center or could be conducted at home. And it seems like, I mean, that's important, I'm not denying it, but it's the core of many of these successful programs has been somewhere between 2 to 3 hours per day. So that's my provisional understanding based on the American data that I've looked at. Now, in terms of the other question you asked about early, I think in terms of wise educational policy, you can save a lot of problems by actually sending children, in terms of this Child Development Index that we heard about earlier. You can actually avoid problems like special education, remedial education, by essentially starting earlier and getting children ready for going to school. I think that is something that should be embodied in public policy, that the earlier years play a very important role. And it's not just kind of either or. By essentially investing in those early years, you make later investments more productive, or stating it slightly negatively, there are fewer problems to solve downstream, and which are typically costlier. So I would argue that early is quite important, especially if there's not much evidence now. I don't think there is much evidence now, right, on many of these early childhood programs in place. There could be a lot of leverage that could be had for Hong Kong by putting some more Hong Kong dollars in those early years, provided they're enriched programs. You want high quality programs. You don't want to just throw money away or have some token program. So those are the kind of the broad answers that I would suggest, but open to others.
Thank you, Professor Hammond. Another question which I would like to address to Professor Stephen Andrews, Dean of Faculty of Education of Hong Kong U, and maybe Professor Hammond could supplement as well. Now, many governments invest heavily in schooling and universities, but seldom invest practically in preschool education and parenting. Why is the reason for that? And how can we change this kind of policy?
Well, I think it's very true that has been the history of educational development in so many parts of the world, but I think that's very much changing. I think the arguments that Professor Heckman expressed so eloquently tonight are consistent with arguments that have been made around the world and which have gained great currency in Hong Kong, for example, with the free kindergarten education initiative, for example, representing the government's firm intention to invest early and wisely in the sorts of ways that Professor Heckman has mentioned. But I do think that in the Hong Kong context, I would pick up the point that Professor Heckman has just made about the importance of the quality of the experience that we provide for our children in kindergartens, and the importance of the government investing in quality teacher preparation and teacher education for teachers at kindergarten level. I think that it's absolutely vital that Hong Kong moves towards full professionalization of the kindergarten profession with graduate education, graduate preparation for teachers in kindergarten being an aspiration which should be achieved as soon as possible, because I think the quality of the experience is absolutely crucial if the investment is actually going to achieve what we want it to achieve.
Would Professor Hammond like to supplement on the reason why many countries actually did not invest too much in preschool education and parenting, and only invest most of the money into universities and schools?
Well, I mean, there are good political economy reasons for that. But I think one of the biggest factors is a kind of a political or even traditional argument that the early years are the province of the family, and later, after the family has done its job, it can send the kids to the schools. I think that's a very artificial separation, but it's one that's very traditional, that the family, the early years are the province of the family. The only problem with that argument is that many families are not that well equipped to provide that environment, and therefore it kind of leaves begging a huge problem that many families, I wouldn't want to say are dysfunctional, but aren't as strong as they could be if we supplemented them with some of the preschool years. So I think it's really been a very strong resistance to recognizing that many families are under stress, and that providing that family environment can be extremely beneficial. I think people, just at least in my own country, in the US, people don't want to acknowledge that family life is under stress. I think it's much more under stress, as I understand it, in the US, at least in a relative sense. Many more relatively disadvantaged children. But the absolute level may be lower in some of the slums and very poor areas. But whatever, I think it's just a failure to recognize that the family needs supplementation, and disadvantaged families can really benefit from that. I think that's something really important to keep in mind. Oops. Musical microphones here.
Yes, now we have got a question from the floor about a health question. So maybe Professor Leung from Chinese U or Professor David Hall could answer this question. The question is, breastfeeding has high level of DHA that helps IQ development, but DHA is found in baby powder. Can baby powder milk replace human milk based on the nutrient level?
Okay, so I think it's one of the things that we get from the breast milk, but certainly I think breast milk actually have much more than the DHA. Actually, especially on the soft psychosocial development, the bonding between a mother and child, I think these are the additional things that actually formula cannot replace. So I think, well, it's like the protein content, also it's much lower and in breast milk, and that will also work against the development of obesity if you have breast milk.
Yes, exactly. Can I remind the audience to be a bit more quiet? Can you just keep a little bit more quiet? Yeah, because some of our guests actually could not hear the answers too clearly. Yes, with Professor Hall, you have some supplementation about the difference between breast milk and milk powder?
Sorry, Patrick, I simply cannot hear the question.
Oh, sorry. Now the question is, DHA has been found to be very important for the brain development. And milk powder contains DHA as a major composition as well. So could milk powder replace breastfeeding?
Are you suggesting that milk powder should replace breastfeeding? Did I hear you correctly? Patrick,
Sure.
was the question about milk powder replacing breastfeeding?
Yes.
I want to get out of here alive tonight.
Yeah.
I don't think that any pediatrician or any nutritionist would suggest that any milk formula should replace breastfeeding except in very special circumstances. And whatever the nutrient mix in formula, I think we shall wait a very long time to see evidence that that is the equal of breastfeeding, let alone superior to it. But of course, there is always an issue about the practicalities of breastfeeding.
Yeah.
And without going off onto a long spiel about one of my favourite topics, one of the biggest problems is that a lot of breastfeeding counsellors are simply not up to the job. And a lot of mothers never have access to a breastfeeding counsellor. And a lot of mothers give up breastfeeding simply because they've had such lousy advice. That's a much bigger issue in my mind than the exact chemistry of the formula.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hall. Maybe we encounter two more questions, okay? Maybe Professor Hall has a question.
Yeah, I think this question is also for David Hall. It's from Shirley Tang. There is some evidence showing that the effect of SES on language and cognitive skills may be moderated by extracurricular activities. In other words, the school provides some activities to those children who are from low SES family. The achievement gap between high and low SES could be filled. Do you agree? Yeah.
The achievement gap in general, as you've seen from the data, gets wider as children get older. And this is one of the issues about early childhood intervention, that it's not a magic cure. You have to sustain the intervention with continuing good quality education after the child has started formal schooling. But I think if you
The
look
question
at
is
the...
about the role of extracurricular activities.
Well, it seems to me that we're trying to split hairs here, really. The quality of education overall is what's important. And there are many schools in the UK which have appalling results, which have been turned around simply because of the whole ethos of the school being changed. And that would include the attitudes within the school, the involvement of the parents, certainly lots of extracurricular activities which increase children's involvement and self-esteem and happiness. But as a pure research study, I suppose it's an interesting question. But in the real world, it's the quality of the whole education package that really matters. And that really depends on the quality of leadership. And I've said many times that a good principal of a school should be paid many times what I'm paid as a medical consultant.
Right. Could we have the last question for Professor Hartman? Would the audience be reminded just to keep a little bit quiet for a while? Okay, we will have the last question for Professor Hartman. Please keep your voice a bit softer. Okay, a question for Professor Hartman. Is there a dose-response relationship between enrichment program and desired outcome in terms of cognitive, social, emotional capabilities? Or would there be a plateau that could be reached? Or indeed, it is a reversal response may occur if there's over-enrichment?
Let me read that.
Yeah, sure.
I couldn't hear it.
A long question.
Yeah, no, it's so noisy. Is there a dose result of an enrichment program and desired outcome in terms of cognitive, social, or a plateau can be achieved, or indeed reversal?
Too noisy.
Oh, there's over-enrichment. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a subtle question to ask if you can do too much of a good thing. I haven't seen that. It depends on partly what you mean by a good thing. If you thought the parent was sort of excessively controlling and maybe stifling the child, then you would expect there would be some nonlinear relationship. But to be honest, I haven't really, I wouldn't say, certainly there is a dose response in the sense that there are experiments that have been conducted where you supplement the life of the child and you do see the family life of the child, and you do see improvements in the cognitive and socio-emotional capabilities. Now the question is whether you reach a plateau. I think a plateau is very hard to achieve, especially for a young child. There's kind of I wouldn't say limitless, but there are large possibilities. So you can improve a child and you can do more of a thing. So so you can do more of a good thing and you can improve it. As an economist, I'm concerned with saying, well, if we have a fixed budget, is the extra gain you get from spending on the more advantaged child as high as the extra gain you might get from a severely disadvantaged child? That's the nature of the question that I look at, and that's slightly different from the question you raised. But I do think the structure is such that it's very unlikely that with beneficial early investments, social stimulation, good teaching, that you're going to reach a stage where the children are getting too much and it may even be negative. I haven't seen it. I don't know about yourself. I mean, generally there's the more the merrier, but maybe the growth is not quite as high at extremely advantaged environments.
Maybe it depends on the age.
What's that?
Probably depends on the age.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just commenting that the question might have different answers at different ages.
Correct.
And so the probability of a child getting too much in the early years in most families, I think, is low. Although we do see increasingly programs being advertised are incredibly intensive. And one wonders about the pros and cons of that.
Right.
So it does depend on age, and it depends on sensible parenting and sensible balance. Perhaps there are some children who are getting too much and it may be damaging, but not very many. There are far more who are getting far too little.
Professor Heckman, can I venture one last question? Yeah, the question is this. Since early intervention is so important, I was wondering whether the most effective way to help with providing that stimulus, the right stimulus to kids, is parenting education. You know, if you educate the parents, they interact with the kids all the time.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean quite by parenting education, but most of these programs that have been successful have had the effect of changing the nature of the interaction between the parent and the child. And I completely agree that the parent is with the child many more hours than even a school teacher would be. And so intervening in a beneficial way in that relationship and promoting that has, I think, huge returns. But to me, that there's a continual, it's a common model. I think it's a model of interaction. The parent plays a huge role, but also the parent plays a role in supporting the child in the school as well. So it's completely right. And this takes me back to the point that the parenting, that the state of parenting in many countries is too controversial a topic for people to address. But it's exactly improving that and improving the way they work with the child that's going to ultimately have the most beneficial effects. So I agree with the thrust of the question. Go ahead, please.
Professor Hammond, maybe I can supplement a bit. There was actually a study or a program in Hong Kong about 2 years ago where a number of kindergartens collaborate with university professors and conducted a study or a program to support parents of kids of 2-year-old kids. And they have this kind of group programs, some kind of sharing among parents, and some kind of consultation to the parents and so. After half a year, they reassess, compare the baseline and the after treatment performance. And they found that the performance in terms of parent-child relationship has improved a lot. And also the behavior of the children in various kinds, cognitive or behavioral behavior, everything also improved quite a lot. And it seems to suggest that this kind of program, some kind of program to support parents of 2-year-old kids are very useful. And we try to promote to other kindergartens now. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, what I've seen is that programs that directly work with the parent or directly work with the way the parent interacts with the child provides information in some cases. We know that for certain disadvantaged groups, there's just basic lack of knowledge, right, about what's an effective strategy. So, for example, teaching a pregnant young girl, first-time pregnant young girl, that smoking is bad for the fetus and the drinking is bad and the drug use can be bad, I think is a hugely beneficial impact, can be, and it's demonstrated with studies that can be an enormous effect. So by changing the parent and changing the knowledge that the parent has, I should say, and then working with the parent to see how they can work with the child and improve the child, I think there's a basic lack of knowledge which can be supplemented. But you just have to do it in a non-coercive way, though. If you start telling parents you're a bad parent and start lecturing or making some kind of moralistic statement, it's going to be a disaster. You've got to bring the parent in, and that suggests a different approach, which is basically offering it voluntarily, giving them advice, taking them, and some parents may ignore it. I think that's a risk. But I think the most of the parents will listen, from what my experience would be. Maybe others have other experience.
Actually, in that program I just mentioned, it seems that we really didn't give a lot of professional support, but actually the sharing among the parents, the participating parents, so that some parents can learn from others' experience.
Correct.
Already help a lot.
Right. No, I mean, that's part of the experience. That's one of the arguments that people have made for sort of integration across different socioeconomic groups in schools and precisely because they're offering a model. Sometimes parents of disadvantaged or advantaged families will say, oh, you might try this with your kid. So I think this kind of social mixing can have real advantages. And there's some study. I had a postdoc at Chicago who actually, it's relevant to you, he's looking at South African data, actually, and was finding evidence of exactly this, of integrated schools. There was interaction across socioeconomic groups in terms of disadvantaged families learning from the advantaged families and improved parenting practices. And so, I mean, he was primarily looking at the benefit of integration. So I do think there's some notion of exchange of ideas. Parents, mothers learn from each other. Here's an idea. So I think facilitating that can be very, very beneficial.
Yeah. Many thanks, Hoi Wei, and thanks, Professor Hartman. You must agree with me that we have a very fruitful discussion. Let's invite all the panel discussants to have a group photo at the front of the stage.